Hello and welcome to the EXP Required podcast where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. I am Jack and I'm joined by Mol. How you doing, Mol?
I'm not too bad today because the weather is finally cooled down. I know we talk about the weather every podcast. I feel like that's something that we have to do at this point.
Yeah, and also I actually mentioned my own name this time because
Oh,
last
you
last
did,
time I
you?
didn't mention my name, which was because I'm not Jack, I am Jack. Anyway, you are Jack, I am Jack, we are Jack.
We're all Jack in this
Yeah,
house.
yes. So obviously, worth mentioning, we've talked about this offline, but the YouTube channel seems to be doing quite well. Some
Yes.
people might not know we have a YouTube channel, or we'll try and link that up everywhere at some point. But we're at 97 subscribers now, and our videos are doing quite well. So thank you very much for everyone that's watched.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Please continue to watch this space. Hopefully, we'll be able to put out stuff with, even if you don't agree with, we'll make you laugh.
So today we're going to be talking specifically about Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy III for you people that are wrong because it's Final Fantasy VI. I thought I'd just get that little dig in there because it is Final Fantasy VI. This game was released on the SNES or Super Famicom on April the 2nd, 1994 in Japan, and later that year on October the 20th in North America as Final Fantasy III. So obviously a little bit of history on that, which I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast knows. Final Fantasy I was released as Final Fantasy I in North America. Final Fantasy II was skipped over, as was Final Fantasy III. And then Final Fantasy IV from Japan was released in North America as Final Fantasy II. 5 was skipped over, and then 6 became 3. So that's
just to make it easy for everybody involved.
Just to make it really, really easy. So when people mention Final Fantasy 3, actually I mean 6 is just one of those things. It later came to the PlayStation on March the 11th, 1999 in Japan, October the 5th, 1999 in North America, and February 27th, 2002 in the EU, which I thought was quite surprising. It was so much later. One of the things about this as well is that it featured as a big part of Square's E3 1999 presentation with the FMVs coming up of the different characters, which was...
Right, of course. I remember seeing those for the first time and kind of being in two minds, thinking that it both looked awful, but really, really good at the same time.
Yeah, so that obviously, because it was 1999, it would have been before Final Fantasy VIII came out. So obviously at that particular E3, Final Fantasy VIII was the big deal. I went through all the E3 footage for a video I did ages ago. And basically, the re-release of 6 was on par with for the release for
really?
for
wow.
9. Yeah, because it was for American audiences. They love 6. They love 3. They can't name it right, but they love it. I should stop having digs. It's not your fault that you learned it was 3. And also, just worth mentioning, this came out on various other platforms, but the most significant one was probably the Game Boy Advance in 2006, 2007. And obviously, very recently, last year, 2023, was the Pixel Remaster, which we'll be talking about in a bit, which I think is fabulous, by the way. So yeah, all the various ports have got their own quirks, mainly with different glitches causing different things. And a notable translation thing is that Ultima Weapon is known as Atma Weapon in the original SNES version.
Yes.
And Phoenix Downs are spelt with an F, which I suppose makes more sense phonetically. Phoenix Downs. Phoenix Downs. I don't think they were called Phoenix Downs in the original, though, were they? They were they didn't have Phoenix Downs in the original, did they? First Final Fantasy 1 didn't have Phoenix Downs. You had to go to churches, didn't you? Or whatever they were called in the original game. They weren't churches.
Yeah, I think they might have just been called temples at that point. Yeah, I think you're right. I do remember, at least in the original Final Fantasy 3, so not Final Fantasy 6, there is a set amount of Phoenix Downs that you can collect in that game. Yeah, boy, that drove me nuts when I was playing it. Thankfully, that's the only time that they ever did that. But yeah, it's
Thankfully, yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? Just as a slight tangent, the different rules on Phoenix Downs change depending on what version of the game you're playing and what game you are playing. So sometimes if you go to an inn and one of your characters is dead, it doesn't cure them, but sometimes it does. So I have no idea of what version of what does that. So that, you almost need an entire spreadsheet just to understand and explain that.
As a nice tangent, I've just remembered the way that I met my best friends when I was in high school, secondary school. This was a group of people that I'd met recently, but I wasn't particularly close with. And one of them had been off sick for a couple of weeks. She was ill quite a lot anyway. She came back in to school one day and one of my other friends went, "Oh, did someone cast Phoenix Down on you?" And I turned around and I was like, "You guys play Final Fantasy?" And that was it. We were inseparable for the next 7 years. It was wonderful.
What film was it? Did we just become best friends? I think it was Step Brothers or something. Yeah. It's that thing. Yeah. No, it's, oh my God. Wow. It's like a language thing, isn't it?
It really, really is. And I just remember all of our other non-gaming friends just being like, "Oh, Jesus Christ, there's another one. Okay, here we go."
Oh no, more of their spreading.
Yeah. And unfortunately for them, it remained terrible for the next 7 years as well.
Yeah. So obviously, interestingly, I'm sure we'll delve into this in a bit more detail at some point. But this game, obviously, we just mentioned there, didn't come to Europe until much later. And because of that, there are various different versions of this game. But They mostly match. There are obviously quirks with some of the glitches I've talked about before, particularly for speedrunners and stuff like that. They would probably argue the games are very different. But actually, like, it's quite interesting that out of all the games that we've talked about in the past, it seems like this is the closest one to the original intention of the game. I don't think it's particularly, I think the script was probably slightly different, I can imagine. But like when we talked about the original one being very different, obviously I know that those 7 and 8 had significant game changes, the 7 being the extra weapons you'd battle, along with obviously the magic being called different things at that point.
Yes.
And 8 obviously had like the junction exchange stuff you could do in the international version as well.
Could you not do that in the original?
No, you couldn't do it in the original. So there are things like that where, to me, I don't know whether it's just my perception, where from my understanding, like all versions of this game are pretty close to each other. Performance issues aside, which we'll get to in a bit, I'm sure. Terra was called Tina in Japanese.
Yes, I did know that.
But renamed Terra in the apparently because the American playtesters hated the name Tina. I mean,
really, because I remember reading quite recently that it was because they wanted her to sound more exotic, and Tina as an American name was rather exotic for a Japanese audience, but for Americans, I know a Tina, I know 3 Tinas.
Yeah, Tina's a nice name, but it's not as like fantasy as it. I think in Japanese people it probably sounds quite, because I don't think anyone's going to be called Tina in Japan. It's not a very Japanese name.
The hair color comes from as well, isn't it? Because
Really?
Tina originally was, I don't think it made it into the actual game. I think this is more like concept art, but Tina Branford has yellow or blonde hair, whereas Tara Branford has green hair, as we know
I see.
her.
That's interesting.
So sometimes you'll see artwork of Tara with blonde hair and be like, what's going on here? I know that in Dissidia, she's not given green hair. She is given her blonde hair, which works for her image there. But yeah, I always thought a really nice way of actually marrying those two things together would be to give her like blonde hair with green highlights, or the other way around. Actually, mix them. Why not?
In the Final Fantasy VI CG scenes that came with the PlayStation 1 version, doesn't she have blonde hair in that?
Correct, she does.
Yeah, because I'm sure I remember seeing Celeste. Are we going to go for Celeste? Is that how we pronounce it?
I say Celes.
Celes, do you? Right, so it's going to be interesting. So Celeste, I say. So like, she obviously looked very similar to Terra in those FMVs. It's like, are they the same character? That's quite interesting.
Yeah, not to mention that as far as Celes as well, the difference between her concept art and the clothes that she's wearing in those FMVs is so radically different to the sprite that she actually has in game as well. Is she wearing yellow or is she wearing a green leotard? It's up to you to decide.
Yeah, I know I've seen again, I don't know what it is because there's so many of them. I mean, like, just the point about this game is there are so many different mods and different things about this game. It's like a completely different subject in its own right. I saw like a story mod of it. Celeste is wearing like yellow, and at first I thought it was some dodgy mod someone had made, taking all the characters' clothes off because it like looked like flesh tones. I was like, what have I found? Yeah, I think that might be like more in keeping with certain art, I'm sure.
Definitely sounds like it, yeah.
Siren's bum is covered up in all but the original Japanese version. I had to write that in. Siren's bum. Yeah.
When is his bum meant to be?
Siren, not Sabin, Siren. You know, the summon, Siren.
Oh, Siren. For some reason, I thought you meant Cyan for some reason. The samurai. I was like, the older man? When did that happen? I missed the trick.
Maybe it was a different version of the game I was playing. No, Siren's in the original Japanese version, Siren has got her booty out. And then in the SNES version for North America, it was completely covered up. And then for like, I think the European version or one of the versions later, they slightly showed a little bit more skin, like, because
Yeah, it wasn't just Siren. There's a few instances of censorship in 6. And I mean, considering that they were on Nintendo's bankroll at the time, it makes sense. Nintendo has very strict censorship rules. I know we spoke about this in the 1 and 2 episode, but why a lot of their words are also heavily censored. We don't have crosses or churches. We don't have death or holy or anything like that. This also extends to cleavage and butt cracks because we can't have nice things when we work for Nintendo.
Here's a point as well. Like you mentioned there, they can't have death. They don't get around that in this game, though, do they?
No, they do not.
And also, one thing is worth mentioning as well is pubs are called cafes.
Are they?
Yeah. I mean, it just seems a bit weird, doesn't it? Like, we've got to call it a cafe because that pub implies there's alcohol, I guess is what they're going for. But really, like, it's not like a censored word, is it? Like, the amount of times I've heard someone go, I'm going down the pub. I don't go, oh, you can't say that around the kids. It's such a normal thing to do. Yeah, he goes to the pub. Cool, well
Pubs
done.
And cafes. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't walk into a pub and expect a coffee to be given to me, or vice versa, even, actually. I think it would be more shocking if I walked into a cafe and they gave me a pint.
No, clearly they were going for, oh no, that's far too far. We're implying alcohol. Instead we'll have a cafe and then talk about someone destroying the world and murder and all sorts of stuff.
Everything else in this game is just fine.
Yes. Graphic violence is fine. As long as we don't say naughty words, that's too far.
So on that topic, I guess I have to do the asking this time. How did you come to Final Fantasy VI? How did you learn about it, play it for the first time? What was your
Learn about it.
opinions?
Ooh, okay, you've got me.
Activated your trap card.
You've activated. Wow. I bought it back in late 2002, early 2003 after playing 7, 8, and 9 on PS1. I bought the back catalogue of Final Fantasy games. I think I mentioned that in one of the videos we've done. What's interesting about this is a slight tangent. It came with a demo disc containing 2 parts of Final Fantasy X on PS2. So it has. So the version I have has a demo disc for 10, which had, I think it's the Zanakan bit at the beginning, and also running through a bit slightly later on in 10. So it's like basically the first couple of bits of 10. Now, it was the first bit of PS2 software I had. This just goes to show how much of a goody two-shoes kid I was, because I felt naughty owning it because I didn't have a PS2. And I was almost like, am I allowed to have this? So I had hid it in a wallet. Like I can't even spot that I've got that when I haven't got a PS2. That's just how my brain works at that age. Now, I'm going to say it first. The load times were appalling in the PlayStation 1 version. Absolutely disgracefully appalling. I remember in the Phantom Train part of the game, which is fairly early on, pausing the game, going downstairs to get a drink, and then coming back up, and the screen was still black and loading. So it was that. And to be fair, my PlayStation was quite bad at loading games, as a lot of PS1s are. Putting a PS2, it is a lot better, but no, the load times were complete arse. Played the very beginning of this game on a SNES emulator a lot of times, because at the time it was called Final Fantasy 3 in the US, which I've talked about at length already. And the only way to play the actual FF3 at the time in the West was on an emulator with a fan translation, which I was desperate to try and get. Obviously, the confusion between the different versions of 3 made it difficult to find the right ROM. So I ended up stumbling upon Final Fantasy 6, aka 3, a lot of the time. So I've seen that opening screen with the Magitech armor walking across in Mode 7 loads and loads of times with that. I remember it as well, because at the time, this is 2002, 2003, it was old, but I remember it being impressive because it was like the peak of 2D. You know what I mean? I remember it looking in some ways as good, if not better in some ways, than some of the 3D graphics I'd seen. Obviously, I recognized it wasn't as good, quote unquote, and newly technological, but I realized it was impressive.
I mean, I think there's something to be said in the fact that it was the last 2D Final Fantasy before, the technology made the jump. There's something to be said in even fans that grew up with the PS1 stuff first and then went back. There's still that acknowledgement of this is what came before. This is still quite powerful looking, even if, it's not on the same level as what the PlayStation can do, FMVs notwithstanding. I know for my part, the first time that I played Final Fantasy VI, it was a very busy year for me. I believe this would have been 2010 or 2011.
Oh, okay.
I had freshly moved out for the first time, and this was an exam year. I think I was preparing to try and figure out what I wanted to do with university. So there was a lot going on in my life. And that summer it was like, right, I've never played Final Fantasy VI. I'm going to do it. I want to, in my life, at least once go through every single numbered title there is in the Final Fantasy series. Went onto eBay looking for a cartridge for the GBA because I had a DS at the time, which, can play Game Boy cartridges. And my eyes started watering at the prices of the GBA carts. I remember that I think the one that I saw and had to just close the window was about £180, which I'm still not prepared to pay, honestly. So I emulated it for the first time, and I believe it was the PS1 version. I think it took me about a week and a half of just solidly sitting down and going through it with no guide, nothing like that. And I was blown away by it, honestly. It wasn't anything like I expected it to be. I had heard nothing but praise for Final Fantasy VI over the years, but very little actually about it. So going in, I kind of didn't really know what to expect at all, which, for being almost 10 years after it actually released on the PlayStation 1 in a European region was kind of a huge deal, actually, even before the internet was as big as it is now. Yeah, it blew me away. There isn't a game like it out there, and I think that's why it has the reputation that it does now still.
I think it's interesting. I've seen written down, some people have said that Final Fantasy VI deserves the reputation Final Fantasy VII gets. I understand Final Fantasy VII has significance, especially in the West and certainly in Europe, with being the first one we got. So I think because of that, it's become the greatest title, the one that's synonymous with Final Fantasy, because it hit so many more people at a certain age. 6 to me always felt like the Americans' game. Probably to do with the fact that a lot of content creators over the years have talked about how much they love this game, how impactful it was on them, and how they realized that storytelling could be told through the gaming medium. And also there's loads and loads of parodies that I've talked about before on Newgrounds with Final Fantasy games. There was loads to do with 6. there's scenes in some of those Flash movies that I remember being in the actual game that aren't. Like,
Oh, wow.
So there's a line, this could be in one of the versions, but it might not be, where obviously there's a part about Locke's character where he's a thief, but he wants to be called a treasure hunter, right? And there's a line I've read somewhere where he says to someone, "Call me a treasure hunter or I'll kick your lungs out." Now that phrase doesn't appear in the Pixel remaster. I don't think it appears in the PlayStation version. If it does and they've censored the pubs, there's something wrong with them. But I think it's probably one of the parodies I've read. There's a scene in one of the parodies where Setzer and Locke are on the blackjack, and then Setzer tells Locke not to dive bomb Figaro Castle. And I remember that being in the game. It's not in the game. It's in some parody. And there's also a scene where Setzer comes along in the blackjack to save the day. And then the FMV scene of Setzer holding the cards up comes, and then they edit it so that Setzer's sprite comes out and flies into the castle and then hits it and gets impaled on it. Again, these things I remember being in the game, but they weren't. You know what I mean? Like,
it's incredible what time can do to memory.
Like quite funny. Because I played through it recently. So you like this game then?
Yes, I do. In stark contrast to last episode, yes, 6 is incredible. And actually, to piggyback off of what you just said, I think some of the biggest and long-standing arguments that I've seen on the internet over the years has been, which is the greatest game, Final Fantasy 6 or Final Fantasy 7?
Yeah.
Which has the greater villain, Sephiroth or Kefka? You know, there's no end to the arguments. And I don't think it's quite the same as it was, say, like 10, 15 years ago, but I remember those flame wars back in the day.
Yeah, I remember them as well, but it always felt like this wasn't ours 6. It felt like it was it was like in a way, maybe my perception, that it was like the Americans were saying 6 is better and the Europeans were saying 7 was better. That's how it felt to me. Be interesting to see if that's actually the case. Probably like the only reason I think maybe the Europeans haven't resonated with 6 as much is because those loading times are completely horrendous. Like they certainly annoyed me enough to not want to pick it up like I have recently, where I can go through and just play it. I mean, obviously, like, it's really frustrating if you die in a battle and have to reload, having to go through those loading screens. It's the same with a lot of early PS1 games. Symphony of the Night, Castlevania is an absolutely phenomenal game. Like top 10 games ever made, probably. But the load times in that are atrocious. If you die, it takes like a minute and a half to get back to where you were. It's like, oh god, I can't believe I got to do this. So like, I mean, it doesn't take away from the experience. Interestingly, it hasn't taken away from the review score of the PS1 version, because it's still like in the 90s. And again, I think at the time, people probably had PS2s to play it on, so they were playing it on the PS2, which makes things load a lot better. So it's probably my fault for not having a PS2 until later. And that's literally the only gripe I have about the game. I mean, I have a few points about the story, but I don't think they're from a quality perspective. I think they're just about characters I don't like, that I'm not supposed to like, or I'm supposed to resonate with differently. It's not a dig at the writing, it's a dig at those characters, shall we say.
There are a lot of characters in Final Fantasy VI.
There are a lot of characters in this game.
I think it's the biggest cast out of all the Final Fantasy games.
14.
Wow.
Should we play that game? Can we name them all again? Because we did it with 4.
Oh, Jesus. I'm not sure I'll be able to actually do it this time. Let's see. We've got Terra, we've got Sally's, we've got Locke. Obviously, those are the big 3. Then we've got Edgar and Sabin, Setzer, Cyan or Cyan, Shadow. Are we counting Interceptor as a character?
No.
Gao, Go-Go, Umaro the Yeti, Mog. Oh, no. There's 2 more and I can't think of them.
You give up?
I'm going to have to. Oh, no, that's embarrassing.
It's Realm and her grandfather, whose name now escapes me.
I forgot about Realm. Oh, yeah. I'm the worst.
Well, that's poor Realm. What's her grandfather's name? Strago. Or Strago, yeah.
Yeah.
See, probably easier to do. I mean, obviously, you've got a couple missed at the end there, but like Interceptor, we will include because he's best boy. I think Interceptor's a better character than Shadow. Maybe
I'm
not quite.
going to be real with you, Jack. Any Final Fantasy game that includes a dog is a good Final Fantasy, and I'm going to extend the net to 16 here. We have Interceptor, we have Angelo, we have Torgal. I want a game.
What's the one in 15? There's like an army of dogs, isn't there?
There's not an army. There's Umbra. That's the name.
Isn't there 2 of them?
There is another one, but
one is like basically keeps turning up, going, "Lol, I've got a letter for you." Like
that's Umbra. Prina doesn't really hold as much story significance, though.
Interesting. I mean, like any Final Fantasy that's got dogs, quite a lot of them have got dogs, as it turns out. Okay, well, that's kind of like the intro. There's loads of points we can jump off with this. I've certainly got the stuff I definitely want to talk about. We'll talk about it generally. I think this is an absolute classic. I think playing through it recently, pretty much all the way through, has kind of moved it up my list of favorite Final Fantasy games.
Really? Okay. Whereabouts was it before?
Well, I think before it was sort of in the annals of like, I like the story, I like the characters, but the game wasn't as resonant for me because my memory was probably somewhat influenced by the performance issues back in the day.
And the parodies.
And the parodies, exactly. Yeah. Now, like playing it, I think it's fair to say, let's get objective, it is the most balanced Final Fantasy.
Okay.
What I mean by that, I mean, the term balance can mean multiple things for different people, but I think effectively 6, 7, and 8 are quite similar in a sense that 8 obviously has the setup where every character is more or less the same. And the only difference is their limit breaks. 7, they kind of have jobs, but the materia system enables them to pretty much be however you want them to be. 6 gets the balance right, where everyone has an individual job, but they can also learn, for the most part, all of the magical spells and stuff like that. And I think that they tie that in with the story a lot, certainly better than they do in 8. I can't believe I said that. But, you know, it's everyone's got their own job. So Celes has the Rune Knight ability and can use magic. Terra can use magic. And then later on in the game, everyone can use magic. But it's significant to the story that everyone can use magic. It's not just a case of like everyone's the same like they are in Final Fantasy VIII. You could argue in Final Fantasy VIII they're all the same because they're all trainees, but I don't know. It just seemed to me like it made more narrative significant sense that everyone could use all that technology. And
I did like the fact that even though everyone does have a job, some of them are a bit more obfuscated than others. Like, I wouldn't be able to exactly narrow down what job Celes has, for example. Like, is she a mage or is she a sword user primarily? Terra likewise. And then, you know, obviously you have characters like Cyan, the samurai, or you have Locke, the thief, or Sabin, the monk, stuff like that. But then there are also extra items which give you certain abilities. So anybody can jump so long as they have the dragoon boots. Locke can mug so long as he has the appropriate item. You know, that was a really nice look into, okay, they're still including these really iconic jobs. They're just not saying it outright. It really works in the setting as well. Final Fantasy VI is very unique in that it's very, very obviously a Final Fantasy game. Like, the elements are all there. But at the same time, it feels like its own thing as well.
Definitely. I think, I mean, using the comparison example there, let's take a character from Final Fantasy VIII, just because I love doing that. I have to do it. Quistis, right? Quistis has got a whip. Cool. But her I guess her job would be Blue Mage.
Yes, and that's just based on her limit break.
But just based on the limit break, it's far, you know, obviously in that game, a lot of the time you like get everyone on low health to be able to use the limit breaks, but the limit breaks are supposed to be extra attacks. Everything else about her character, there's nothing about her job and her role that really ties in with the story specifically. I think the only character in Final Fantasy VIII's main roster that does is Zell, because he's the monk.
Yes.
And it, you know, it ties in with his personality, and he's always like punching the air and stuff like that. I don't think 8 does that particularly well, whereas in 6, I think every character, even if their abilities aren't so, I don't use them very often, they tie in with their narrative. For example, Gao. I'm not a big fan of Gao's abilities, but I do like how it ties in with the story that he's this feral child that's been sort of left alone, and actually you have to gather his abilities because he's more feral and he learns from the animals he's around. That's a really good narrative concept. Even if I don't like using the character in battle, I can respect it.
Absolutely. I think 6 occupies a really interesting mid-ground, actually, between 8's characters not really having an identity as far as their jobs. And then I know we talked about in the Final Fantasy IV episode how the characters' classes are so like intricately weaved with the characters themselves. So, you know, you have really as a summoner, that's a whole big part of her character, and Cecil's getting rid of his Dark Knight history to become a paladin. Like, the characters and the jobs are inextricably linked. It feels very much in between both of those states for Final Fantasy VI. I mean, you have characters like Sabin and his whole monk story and his character art. It's definitely a part of his character and it's central to who he is, but it isn't as important as the characters in Final Fantasy IV, but it's way more important than the characters in Final Fantasy VIII. You know, everyone has little bits and pieces that actually are influenced by their job. You have Realm's Pictomancy and that whole small character arc in the World of Ruin where she's painting for the noble in whichever town that is.
Jabba the Hutt, it looks like, doesn't it? He's painting.
Yes, it really does. But, you know, other than that, and also her sketching Ultros very early on when you meet her, like, Pictomancy isn't really a big part of Rum's character, but it's still there and it's still actually important. It's a really interesting balance that they've struck, and I agree. I think they've done fantastically with it.
Yeah, so that's what I mean when I say balance. I mean, obviously people might think balance in terms of the RPG and stuff like that, because actually, like, similar to 8, it's probably very easy to exploit this game. Like, you just get everyone all the high level magics and stuff like that. But I think, there's also balance in grinding. So you've mentioned before, I actually was thinking this while I was playing it. You said before you don't really like grinding in games. To me, I don't like grinding too much either, but I think it's more fun in this game because the game gives you so many characters, so many abilities that you can test out. So actually, while you're training, you can test out your new skills. I don't think at any point I felt like I was, oh my god, I've got to grind for an hour. Almost felt like, oh, I get to test out these new techniques I've got for half an hour, and in the interim, I was leveling up. That's my perspective on the
That's
grinding.
A really
in this
nice
game.
way of looking at it. Actually, I know that when I was playing Final Fantasy VI for the first time, it was like pulling teeth for me because there were so many characters, and I wanted to see all of the things that they could do. Like actually getting to that point was excruciating for me. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy VI's magic system, for those who don't know, you have to wait until a certain point in the game where you're given magicite items, and you can only learn magic for the most part from these chunks of magicite. Some of the spells that you can learn from Magicite have multipliers, which is, or however long it takes you to learn these spells. Some of them can go up to like, say, 10, and they're learned rather quickly, and some of them are stuck at things like 1. And, you know, to be fair, these are all the high-level spells, which you don't necessarily need to get, but like, oh my god, if I want to cast Faraga, I don't want to wait 20 years to get it first. Like, please take mercy on me.
There's a kind of, funny, we're talking about 8 quite a lot, not because it's my favorite, just because it's interesting how similar the systems are, because in 8 you've got the junction system, which there's a risk reward with that, where if you had 100 fire rigger spells, for example, you could use them, but then you would lose the stat boosting ability if you use too many of them. Whereas in this, you have to wait until you've fully got it before you can use it. It's very similar to the mechanic of the equipment in Final Fantasy IX, where
I was just thinking where
you put a piece of equipment on and you can use that ability, and then when you take that equipment off, you can't use it unless you've mastered it. That's, I think, better. But I think
I liked 9 systems more than I did 6's.
But I think the reason they've done that is to make it so the game's not broken. You know, because if you put something on, you can now automatically become a superstar. I think it's done that way because basically, like, any character can have any magic. I mean, you probably wouldn't be able to do it because only certain espers teach certain things. I think it's intentional is what the point I'm making. I don't think it's a case of like, let's make you grind, ha ha ha. I mean, like, you could obviously only use each esper once in the battle as well, which is to stop you just spamming the same thing over and over again. That is quite the opposite of Final Fantasy VIII, where pretty much you can play that entire game with just using the GFs in that game. No, it's really, I'm really surprised at how much it felt like Final Fantasy VIII in terms of the mechanics. Like, it felt like clearly the same teams worked on them, perhaps they changed their idea. I just think in 6, like I say, the balance was there. It felt like it was the least exploitable because of what we just described there. Obviously, for someone that doesn't like grinding, it's probably a bit more painful than, say, 8, where you don't have to grind. You just have to go and get some water spells from the fish on the beach, and then you've won. I think before you go into the flying continent about halfway through the game, that jump up in difficulty there is quite significant. But there is also a great place to level up in the not the Materia Cave, no, it's the Esper Cave.
Yes,
and you can go in there. And I remember like going, I'm going to get each character up to level 25. And I only spent like an hour, and like I say, it was fun because I went through each of the characters that I hadn't really put in my party, and I could learn how their abilities worked and stuff like that, and go, well, actually, I want them to be a healer, and it was not too much for me.
So piggybacking off of that, then you've mentioned that some of your characters you don't particularly enjoy. Which ones were those?
Right, Cyan, as we call him, Cyan. I'm going to call him Printer Ink from here on out. At first, I thought, oh, isn't it nice that there's a story with him, you know, saying goodbye to his family. Like, later on in the game, he starts sending love letters to some woman whose partner has died. Earlier on in the game, I don't know the characters' names. Like, you go to one town, and that character's been sending letters to his long lost love. And then the big event happens. Spoiler alert for Final Fantasy VI, where the world's cut in half. He dies, and she's still receiving letters from Cyan. What a dick! It's like, I think they're trying to write it that he can't move on, she can't move on. But it really annoys me because he's sending her letters pretending to be this person. And then he meets her in person and he's like, you need to move on. And it's like, whoa, hang on. You've just basically just been like pretending to be her dead partner, and you're not going to like apologize for that or do anything for her to make her feel better. But then he has this repentance later on, slightly later on in the story. It's the next part you do where you go into his dreams and like, he says goodbye to his family, and he reclaims his honor. I remember thinking it felt flat for me because I was like, well, you've also done this complete dick move there, and you haven't apologized to this poor woman.
That's
like,
completely
I don't know.
Fair.
It just didn't. At the beginning, when I was seeing his character the way he was, I thought this is really, really cool. But then it just seemed like for that, it just fell flat. I don't know. I thought your opinion on that is.
I think honestly, I didn't really have much of an opinion on Cyan. I agree that's kind of a real dickish move. I think the biggest dickish move is at this point in the game, the world has been like it's gone to shit for a year, and he's just sat in a cave writing letters. What are you fucking doing with yourself, bro?
Yeah.
Get a better hobby.
Yeah, it's basically he is the first catfisher in history. Like,
now, for someone who doesn't enjoy technology, that's fantastic to hear.
Yeah, he's literally sitting in a cave pretending to be a more attractive man, like, and sending it to this poor lady and sending her flowers as well. I mean, it's just creepy. You think about it.
He does, however, have a banging mustache. We cannot.
He does have a banging mustache. I don't really like him as a character though in battle. I don't think his abilities are that good. Like, I do with the fact that there's a lot of this in this game where you can't choose what enemy you're attacking. You know, it's kind of like you can't choose it's area of effect or it's against a single target, but you can't choose what that target is with a lot of Cyan's moves till later on. But it just takes a long time to get him to be decent. So like, I don't hate him, and again, I'm not having a dig at the game's writing. I just think he's supposed to be a bit of a Burke. Again, this game's very good at like making very great characters not perfectly fixed. Edgar, I'm mixed on. I am mixed on Edgar because he's a bit of a sex pest, isn't he?
Oh, like, he's ridiculous with it.
And there's a part in the game, right? We've got Realm, who's what, 10? And he asks her how old she is. But to be fair, with that scene, I don't think they were. I think the scene's used to have her turn around to him as a young child and basically tell him to fuck off. I think that's what they're going for because Realm's actually quite a I'm not gonna say well developed.
She's got the most personality amongst the cast, in my opinion.
Yeah, like as a character, like I think they're using that to show that she is good at taking care of herself in the world. But at the same time, there's like undertones there where like she's.
It also doesn't help that Edgar's whole thing, like from the moment that you meet him, is he flirts with every woman he sees, like to the point where every NPC in the Figaro Castle is like, has he tried it on with you yet? Like, my God, he just doesn't stop.
Yeah, the king's a sex pest. It's like, well, literally. Like, there's another scene later on which they've written him that way. I think it's towards the bit where you're in Nash and you're defending against Kefka for the first time, and like there's this stuff between Locke and Celeste. We're going to get to that in a bit, by the way. He makes a comment to Celeste about, you don't have to bother with him, but try with me, and that's like, I know so many people over the years that have done that. And it's just like, don't be a dick. Just like, don't be a complete tool. But at the same time, his emote where he shakes his finger at the screen and has that sort of winking face, I don't think he's a bad man. I think it's more that he's actually very, very insecure and he's trying to make himself out like he has ladies. I don't think he's like a pest, actually. He's not someone that would force himself upon women and be a creep in that sense. All.
I think, and this is something that I think goes for, like, honestly, all of the characters in FF6. They're all actually very, not morally grey, but they're very, very nuanced, every single one of them, which I love. I adore in a cast anyway, and 6 actually really does it to perfection. Edgar in particular, like, from the get-go, it would be very easy to hate him or to be very fed up with him, but he makes up for it by being a genuinely good person. He's on good terms with the Empire, but he's doing it so that he doesn't get attacked. He cares very much for his people, and he's actually in cahoots with the Resistance instead. He's actually got a good heart. He just happens to be kind of a douche about it. And really, in this world, is that such a crime? It's one of those, well, what is the bigger evil here, and can I overlook it? Which it's definitely an interesting viewpoint to take in a game, one that a lot don't necessarily do well all of the time. I don't think that 6 has it perfected either. I mean, as you said, Edgar hitting on Realm is like, that's a thing I just read with my eyes.
Yeah.
But having said that, I don't want to paint him with the bad character brush because of it, It would be unfair to him.
Yeah, I'm not forgiving it or justifying it in any way, but it's not as weird as it could be. I think within the confines of the game, they're just using any excuse to show what his character is. And again, I think it's a lot to do with his insecurities as opposed to his, look at me, I deserve this because I'm a king. I think I'm not trying to justify Edgar. I just start off by saying he's a bit of a pest, isn't he? It's not the coolest. I wouldn't go for a beer with Edgar, let's put it that way.
I think for me, the characters that really didn't land for me were kind of the more joking characters, the ones that don't really have much of a personality. So this is Mog and Umaro and Gogo. I don't really care about any of them, and that's not because they're bad characters. Just If you took them out of the story, nothing changes,
You're totally
and
right.
that makes them nothing.
Apart
Me,
from,
really.
I think the only one that's slightly that would ruin it slightly is Mog, but that's only at the beginning of the story because Mog.
Yeah,
But
and
then
even
again, Mog.
that's
Yeah, but I
negligible.
think the thing is, Mog. It's just a generic Moogle. It's
Yeah.
the Moogles that rescue you. It's not Mog.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting as well because Mog featured on so much of the marketing for this game, especially in America.
Right.
So like, there's obviously the advert of Mog, like. I don't know if you've seen that. There's like actually a commercial where Mog's got like some stop motion for this game. It's on the front cover of the Final Fantasy 3 box, but doesn't really feature in the game. It's a completely optional character. You think you have to use him in the scripted encounter towards the beginning, but you don't have to go and get him later. I think in battle, Mog's pretty good. I do like.
That's the thing. Like all of those characters, as far as the battle system goes, they're halfway decent. But I prefer the story over to the battle system, like any day of the week. So
I do like being able to play as a Moogle. I think that's what it is. But it's not because of Mog has any particular personalities or anything like that. It does fall a little bit flat. I do agree with you there.
What if I told you there's a different character that you could use in this game who does temporarily appear as a Moogle?
Is it to do with Realm's Moogle suit, is it?
Close. It's to do with Strago's Moogle suit.
I did not know this.
Strago occupies the role of a blue mage. Yes. He has magics that obviously he learned from monsters. You can then replicate them. One of them, he puts on a Moogle suit to cast his magic. And I was looking through the Ultimania archive book, which is kind of a very, very small conglomeration of the Ultimanias, or parts of the Ultimanias of all of the Final Fantasy. So rather than one big thick book for FF6, this was the first volume, so it's
the generic
1 through 6. Yeah, and it's just a few pages on each. All of the characters in Final Fantasy 6 actually have their likes and dislikes listed, which I love reading about. Like, it doesn't mean anything in the actual way of the game. Strago's treasure and his interest is making monster costumes, which is like, this dude is in his 80s, and you know what? It's kind of hilarious, actually. I really fuck with that.
Making monster costumes.
So you can absolutely still play as a Moogle. He would be fantastic at Halloween. Other likes that really stood out to me, there were only 2. Most of them were pretty generic, actually. We had Sabin, who is listed as liking walnuts, right? But his dislikes are eating nuts. What's going on there?
He's crushing walnuts. He's crushing walnuts with his thighs. That's the point. That's the joke there, I think, isn't it?
Because
well, I don't know. He's probably both at the same time. Probably what it is. He's just such a strong man. I like crushing nuts, but I don't like eating them. Oh my God, that's really weird when I say it like that. Maybe he does. I don't know. Judge he goes up to the mountains and he's got a mate up there with him. You know, whatever he gets up to is his business, isn't it? He also suplexes a train in this game. I have to mention that.
He does. I love that made it into the marketing for the Pixel remaster when the official accounts were like, don't worry, you can still do this. Like,
you can still suplex the train. I think it's called something different in the Pixel remaster, but everyone remembers it as suplexing the train.
Oh, yeah.
Offline, before we decided to do Final Fantasy VI this episode, I said to you, let's go for something a bit lighter in Final Fantasy VI. And the reason I said that, I think, was because like it goes on some very serious themes, but there are some quirky parts of this game that don't take itself too seriously. It feels very much like, and I'm pretty sure this is what they're going for, you're watching a play. And there's an element of breaking the fourth wall that comes, especially with the characters and the way they look at the screen and wink at you, that take you out of it a little bit. Ultros, let's talk about Ultros for a bit. The fucking purple octopus that keeps turning up. I love it, but at the same time, like, oh my God, he's so hard to beat at times. The one where he fights you in the opera, we'll talk about the opera in a bit, but he appears like 4 times in the game and then insults you, and he's so out of place. I mean, like when he appears in the water, it makes sense. When he like appears in the sky or appears on stage as an octopus, it's just completely bonkers.
I would love to know what the design behind that was, because you're right, it really does work. It's one of those things of like, okay, giant octopus in the water, fight it, it can talk, whatever. And then it does such impractical things of, and again, if you took Ultros out of the story, nothing would change. No. It would be fine. But to take Ultros out of the story would kind of be to kill Final Fantasy VI's heart a little bit. You're completely right. 6 is a very serious story. Like, overall, it actually has a really like serious bottom line. All the characters are actually, they have a lot that they're dealing with, and the overall tone is very, very dark. But taking away the little nuggets of humor would just be to kill this game and make it really, really unenjoyable.
Dreary.
Actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I said before about how I am not particularly enamored by Gal's ability mechanic, but I do like how he fits into the story and how he's like this kid that's been left. But I do think it's really strange how 10% of the map is pretty much dedicated to just his game mechanics, which is the Veld. The idea being that you go into the Veldt and you can attack, you can get him to leap and he goes and learns the abilities of all the monsters you found in the game. But it's just such a big, sprawling area. It's just a bit strange that
with nothing else in it. You're right.
Yeah, and he's not that important to the narrative. I think he's important as a character, but he's not like one of the main characters, I should say.
No, not at all. Like his character quest, where you meet his father and you discover why he is the way that he is. That's important to Gao as a character, but actually within the realm of the game, again, no, not really. The rest of the characters in the game are actually pretty important, even if it's not like dedicatingly important to the actual plot. You still have things like Strago and Realm belong to the only other place that like there is natural magic. That's a big deal, and their inclusion is important because of that. You know, Sabin's story might not necessarily intersect with the main plot going on, but he's still Edgar's brother, and he gets involved,
contrast.
which makes him important. Shadow and Cyan are also there, and they are affected by the Empire and everything that's happened. Meanwhile, you know, you have the main characters, Terra, Locke, and Sally's, and you cannot disconnect them from the main story. And it's those characters that, with bunny quotes, should have the most screen time. But I like that they don't, because their characters are still very full and they're explored totally. Being able to see more of the world and the characters that actually inhabit it, I really enjoy that, even if, as you said, you know, I don't particularly enjoy them. It's a nice look at the world.
It's interesting you mentioned those three characters. I think those three characters pretty much are the three main, because I was going to ask you actually, who do you think the main character in this game is?
There isn't one.
There isn't one. There deliberately isn't one as well. But actually, if you were going to pick one, it has to be a conglomeration of those three. I think effectively, for the first half of the game, it's Terra. The second half of the game, it's Celes. And Locke is just tying them both together. It's so well written. And I think it's brilliant as well how years before Final Fantasy 13 came out, we had a game that had a female lead, but not just one, had two of them.
That's a really overlooked aspect of this game as well. I know a lot of people go, you know, oh, Terra was the first female character, and this is something that hasn't happened in a Final Fantasy since 6, actually, and I'm almost stunned that it hasn't. Final Fantasy 6 is, to me, two halves. It's two separate games that are wedged together, and they have completely different outlooks. They have different stories going on. There's a very real reason for it. I know the development team themselves were like, well, we could wrap up the world at the end of the World of Balance, but like, we've got more time. Do you want to keep going? And that's why we have the World of Ruin as the whole extra thing, because they had the ability to keep doing, which is wonderful. You don't hear stories like that from the game development world anymore.
No.
But to know that you have this whole one half of the game where the main character is a female character and she's unsure of her place in the world, everyone's a bit like, well, everything isn't as it seems. And then when things become as they seem, i.e. fucked up to the extreme in the World of Ruin, you get a different female character. And I cannot sing 6's praises enough, not just for having two distinctive female personalities in the main positions, but actually for having two distinctive stories overall. It does such a wonderful job at actually telling those two stories. And as you say, having them be tied together with Locke, who's, you know, his presence in the story really cannot be denied. He's a very small character in the grand scheme of things because he's just another guy in the Resistance, but actually, you know, his role is so much larger than that just because of the people that he meets, which is wonderful.
You dare I say it? He is a better version of Zidane from 9.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, he's a more mature, better version of him. Well, a more honest version of Zidane. How to put this into words? I think I'm drawn to characters no matter what their genders are. I like in this game you can play as any, like you can press the shoulder buttons and you can choose who you walk on the world map as at any point. And I'm pretty much just Celes or Terra when I can be, occasionally Locke, because I think that they are such relatively well-written characters, especially from, should we say, a mental health perspective? You know, like the writing, they are real people. They are so well written in the sense that, like, they are so relatable. And it's not because, you know, like, we'll go into it in more detail with Celes in a bit, but they haven't just gone for the, let's make everyone an archetype. They have, in some respects, gone for the damsel in distress side of stuff.
Yeah.
But they've written it so well. It's not just generically like, here's the princess in the castle been taken by the monster, and then the man's got to save her. There are parts of that that come up for both Celes and Terra, but they are enabled to save themselves.
Yeah.
There's none of this, like, the same way from the sort of Mario's got to save Princess Peach from Bowser. I mean, that story has its place. It's not, and it's not bad. It's teased at in this game, but it's also not cruelly so much the other way where the female characters have a pop at the guys as if they're silly for wanting to behave that way. It's ironically balanced between, you know, those two sort of gender roles, you could call them in a sense, in fantasy. I think it's almost like it hasn't really been done as well since. You know?
No, I completely agree with you, actually. Like, don't get me wrong, other Final Fantasy titles, and like obviously the later Final Fantasy titles, they have all had fantastic casts, and they've all, you know, had their ups and downs. There's been characters that I have enjoyed, there's been characters that I haven't enjoyed. I have seen myself reflected in some of them. I haven't been able to connect with others at all. You know, the whole gamut has been run, but like they really don't go as in depth, in my opinion, as Terra or Celes. Or maybe I'm wondering now as well if that's maybe not just I'm unable to see myself in these other characters because I don't experience things the way that they have done. So, like, to be personal, to take Final Fantasy VI's very honest, I suppose, look at the world and to relate it back to the mental health stuff. I mean, very obviously in the second half of the game, you wake up on a solitary island as Celes. It's not named in game as such for Nintendo reasons, but Celes attempts suicide. You know, it's a really big thing. She's at the absolute peak of despair, and no other character in the Final Fantasy franchise has ever not sunk to that depth before, but they've never struggled with the world and their place in it in such a way and then come to that conclusion before. Seeing that on screen was a real wake-up call, actually, when I was playing this for the first time, because I was going through some stuff at the time. And to see a character actually not just brush everything in the world off as, you know, oh, things will get better and my friends are here, like to actually see them get to that point and then to go, actually, it didn't work and I'm going to get up and keep trying. That was a really big deal to me. And I know it was a really big deal to a couple of other people that I know that were playing 6 at the same time or had played it like a little earlier as well. Like, that's a really, really refreshing take on seeing depression, like real genuine depression in a game.
Sorry, I'm not going to be able to diagnose people, but it's pretty clear that Celes suffers from some form of depression.
Yeah, and I mean, who wouldn't in that world either?
It's written in that way. And looking at lots of other stories, especially older stories that were written a long time ago, even around this time, this game's 30 years old more, by the way.
Don't say that, Jack. Why would you say that to me?
The games are, game stories, anything written about around those times, especially in mainstream, should we say, tended to make mental health very
it's a joke, really, isn't it?
Well, there's two sides to it. You either glorify it in certain writing, or you make it either a joke or that person somehow lesser because they have that issue. This doesn't do that, and for a 30-year-old game, it's incredible. I mean, like, there's lots of things we talk about. You're familiar with the TV show 13 Reasons Why, and the suicide is there. In some ways, it glorifies it, or it makes the character a hero, or that they're a hero for having gone through this stuff. Whereas this just that particular scene you're talking about, only Celes knows about it.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned again in the narrative of we need to help her because she's been through this. It's such a private thing because obviously the reason it happens in narrative sense is because the last straw is that Sid, who she calls Granddad, which is like, he dies, and then she just basically just like gives up. And then the thing that makes her keep going is she finds Locke's bandana on the beach. Now, we'll get into their relationship in a bit, but I think it's fascinating how, and this is the whole theme of the story, and it's definitely worth exploring. And this is something with this game, it's something that probably should be taught in schools as some kind of grand story, because the whole overarching theme of Final Fantasy VI, no matter how bad things get, there's nothing you can't come back from. Which I think is a theme that I've seen in other fiction before, but it's done so well here is that the world, basically, the villain wins halfway through the game. He wins,
which is unheard of, by the way.
Well, it's unheard of. It's touched upon in certain elements of fiction. Obviously, we got the big one recently was Thanos winning at the end of Infinity War in the Marvel stories, and Empire Strikes Back is always heralded as the one where the baddies win. But they don't win to a degree where actually, it is impossible to come back from physically. In spoiler alert for anyone who's not seen Infinity War and Endgame, they reset that at the end of Endgame. For the most part, there are some things that stay, but this, it's just like, you know what? They all the characters realize, pretty much all of the characters realize that essentially, like, the importance in life isn't power and ruling over everyone. It's the little moments between human beings, which they don't get any less of in the world of Ruin. In fact, they get more of them. At all. And it's just so poignant.
I think considering that the world does end and is completely changed halfway through the story. And again, halfway through the story, like to see the villain actually get that goal so early and then to keep going, and like he didn't just get his goal, like he went above and beyond with it. There are already so many people that have died by that point. Like I'm thinking of General Leo in particular. Like the world of balance, it might be a world of balance, but it's still not a great place to be ultimately. But then you have characters that, you know, are in hindsight kind of really struggling with their purpose in life. You have Locke, who at that time you don't know is looking for a way to get Rachel back. You know, Terra very outwardly at several points goes, I don't know what I'm living for. I don't know who I am or what a simple thing like love is. You know, I'm looking for my purpose. Cyan sees his home ultimately annihilated, and you know he's dealing with that still very much so in the world of Ruin. Maybe not in the healthiest way, but you know, you do you, pal. And then to see all of these people actually working on themselves in a way in the world of Ruin is like, to go back to Terra as well. Even though she's not the main character in the second half of the story anymore, her role is no less important for it. And she's absent for so much of the second half as well because she's found a purpose. I don't know about you, I find it really, really refreshing. Like, don't get me wrong, I love a good love story. I love reading a bit of romance. It's heartwarming sometimes, but to see a main character find love in a completely non-traditional way is, again, it blew my mind to actually see that in a game like Final Fantasy, where, you know, romance isn't necessarily always the forefront, but it is usually there in some degree. And then for Terra as the, you know, marketed main character of the game, really, and the face of Final Fantasy VI, to turn around and go, I found love. It's for these kids that I'm taking care of. That was, and for that to save her life at the end of the game was just, oh, it gets me.
Yeah,
you know?
it does. There's a moment like that for almost all of the characters. I mean, like that is a particular, we'll jump on that for a bit longer. Yeah, she's basically the first half of the game, she's struggling with her emotions, and a lot of it's to do with her physical treatment, as she's been basically built to be a weapon. And then she's like struggling to understand what love is. And over the course, you can see it in the dialogue. She starts emoting a bit more, and slowly over time builds to it. And then these kids, they all call her like mum and stuff like that, and it's just like, oh my god, it is really gripping. And it's like the again, we talked about it in the Final Fantasy II episode where they use the battle scenes to tell the story. This happens in the game where I don't know the name of the monster, but there's a monster attacking the town where she's keeping all the kids, and she doesn't want to fight.
Death Gaze, I think. Yeah.
No, Death Gaze is
Humbaba.
Humbaba, that's it. And she's like, basically she's frightened of this. It's a really, actually in a way, a generic story of the monster is basically in your head. You know, it's such a classic story. I don't know where it comes from, but it's that the whole point is that she's got a bunch of people she's protecting, and then this monster keeps coming, and eventually she's got to face the demon. And she fights it the first time, and she can't do it. She just gives up because it's more important to protect the characters she's there with. And then she realizes that in order to protect them, she's got to get rid of this demon. Fabulous.
I think one of the really big parts of that story as well is when you meet Terra as Sally, as you go like, look, come with me, we can defeat Kefka. And Terra goes, no, I want to stay with these children. I don't want to fight anymore. I'd rather do this, which was like, but you're the main character. You can't take yourself out of the party. What? And like, she takes ages to come around as well. Like, that was a huge deal for me. Yeah. Mostly because also she was a powerhouse in my game and I really wanted her back because I was struggling without her.
She's a cool character. Locke as well was barely in the game for the second half as well. I think like in terms of the narrative, I think you can get Locke. Obviously the narrative is that the world of Ruin happens. You start off with Celes and you've got to go and get, I think it's Sabin and someone else. You get into your party straight away, more or less.
Setzer. You need Setzer.
I think you'd beat the game with just those three characters.
Correct. Yes.
Right. That's really interesting. But so everyone else is optional, which is weird considering how important they are.
And how big the cast is as well.
So, but Locke, I think, is supposed to be the last character you get because you need two parties to go and get him in the dungeon at the end of the game, which is the Phoenix Cave, which I think is really, really good. What's interesting about that is that you can get him earlier, but like that, it's kind of like supposed to be the last place you go. And I love the little scene where the Locke story with Rachel, he's trying to revive. He uses the Phoenix to revive her very, very briefly, and she pretty much just gives him permission to move on. And says and lets him know, actually, no, I don't blame you. It wasn't your fault that he feels like he's let her down. And actually, she's like, no, mate, you got it wrong. Your entire worldview is based off of a complete perception difference. And then obviously he then moves on. And there's a scene with Sellers, and he walks out and he says, "Oh, by the way, here's all the items from the cave." And he says, "Anyway, we've waited long enough. Let's go and kick Kefka's ass," and winks at the screen. And it's just such an understated moment. It's not like a deeply emotional moment like we just talked about there with Terror and some of the other stuff that's gone on in the story. It's basically just like yeah, no, we just do him. Let's have him. And it's such confidence that, and then the soundtrack comes on in the background. It's just like, you know what a cool character. And he's barely been in the story for so long, but his presence is there because of like that almost like the three characters we mentioned before, Sellers, Terror, and Locke. They are the characters which are absent for a good chunk of the story. And I think they're written in such a way as that when they're not there and how the other characters feel about them is what builds their narrative up. Yeah, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough praise that we can sing about the way that this game is structured.
Anyway, so let's take a little bit of a break and be back in a minute to talk a little bit about the villain and something else. Okay, we're back, and we're going to talk about Kefka. What a prick.
He is, isn't he? He's a character you love to hate.
What I'll say about Kefka, right, is that everyone keeps going on about who's the most iconic Final Fantasy villain, right? I think Kefka is a great villain, but I don't think he's number one. And do you know why I think he's not number one?
Is it the one-dimensional aspect of him?
That's the problem. I love a one-dimensional villain, but there is the personal thing is only one-sided. So he pisses off everyone in this game, right? And they have reason to want him dead. And to be fair, he's probably the only villain where I've been like, you know what, yeah, let's just kill him. Like the rest of the villains have been like, you know what, like there's a bit of grey there. Kuja in Final Fantasy IX, you know, okay, like he was an asshole, but at the same time he had some qualities that, you know, the whole idea was that like if Zidane had been on the same path as him, he might have done the same thing. A lot of the other villains have like, you know, whereas Kefka, like he doesn't care about the main cast at all. I think that's good, but at the same time, like he doesn't have a weakness other than brute forcing him. You know what I mean? Like he's just essentially his weakness is that they're all friends together and he hasn't got that, which is what stops him. But you know, he's great. I'm not going to try and downplay Kefka because he's probably the only Final Fantasy villain that actually scares me. Like the moment I think later on where he gets all the espers out and just turns them into Magicite. He just kills them and it's all like this, like flick, and that is frightening. And it's just like, right, I'll have you now and I want ultimate power. And it's just so flippant. There's no remorse when he does it. He's just a complete sociopath, and it's horrifyingly scary. You know, and the fact as well is like obviously he's Magicite infused, but he's just a human. He's just a human being.
So I think one of the things about Kefka that I think Kefka, again, he's not my number one villain of all time, but I like him probably more than you do. I know there's a line, I can't remember if it's an Imperial soldier or if it's someone else, but they're talking about the magical experiments that they've actually been doing like within the Imperial army. So obviously you have Terra, she can naturally use magic, but she's being mind controlled by a slave crown, I think it's called. And then you have I want to say originally the trio of antagonists, which is Kefka, Celes, and Leo, because they were all Imperial generals. And they were all like subject to Magitech experiments as well. Celes, obviously, they gave her ice magic and it bonded really well with her. Leo is mostly in his right mind as well. You know, there's nothing really wrong there. But I do seem to remember there being a line within the game that said, like, you know, the experiments that they did on Kefka actually broke his mind. Like, there's a reason that he's acting the way that he is, and it's because of the injustices that the Empire has been perpetuating for far too fucking long. And it doesn't make me feel sorry for Kefka because the rest of his actions just they don't warrant sympathy or apologism or anything like that. But it does make me think a little bit more differently about him. If he was just some dude like, you know, say the Emperor from Final Fantasy II, who was just like, you know what, fuck it, I want to conquer the world, I want to burn it all down, that's one thing. But to have a character that's like, oh, you know, we don't get a sense of what Kefka was like before all this experimentation. He could have been anyone. And that's really fascinating to me. But also, it doesn't matter because he's a sociopath. He does things like poison the water supply for a sieged castle where, you know, other generals are like, dude, criminal. What the fuck are you doing? And Kefka's like, shiggles, you know?
It's frightening.
It's haunting in how completely unrepentant he is. And there is no predicting Kefka either. Like you can predict him insofar as we're probably going to fight him at some point, and you do a couple of times, but it gets to a point where, you know, you unleash the espers into the world and okay, well, we might be able to stop the Emperor, and then Kefka turns around and stabs the Emperor for you, and you're like, okay, this is even more fucked than I thought it was. He's a really fascinating villain.
Oh no, he's
Because
good.
you cannot get a grip on him.
No, he is good. I mean, I started off by saying he's good, but he's not on my top. But I think the reason he is towards the top, I just think that in a way, this game's it has the trope in it of I was the villain all along, ha 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 ha, because the game makes out the Empire to be the villain. There's no real personal gripes with Gestalt, the Emperor specifically. It's the Empire. Playing the game, I knew that Kefka was the big bad, but there's a bit of a bait and switch there. He ends up being the big bad. It's obvious when you play it before. I think that probably might have made me think a bit less like, oh yeah, it's obviously going to be him. At the time, if I played it when it first came out, I probably wouldn't have realized that. And he is brilliant. But I think I'm not actually negative about it. I'm just sort of neutral on the point. Every other villain you fight, you can hurt them. There's a way to hurt them. With Kefka, the only way to hurt him is to kill him. Kuja's a flipping nasty piece of work, and he's basically a war criminal. He destroys a planet, and he's awful. But right at the end of the game, he kind of like, it doesn't redeem him, but he sort of like realizes, hang on a minute, he's human, right? And the irony, and it's well written, that Kefka is the least human villain, but he's the only one that's actually human. Completely. That's good, and it's well written. As again, as the point I made earlier, that my gripes aren't based off bad writing. It's just that I think if I was going to do a top 10 Final Fantasy villains list, I wouldn't just put Kefka in at number 1. I'd probably put him at number 2. Probably the best villain, but he's not the best Final Fantasy villain, is kind of what I'm going for. It's only personal to the cast. It's not personal to him. He doesn't give a fuck who anyone is. Like he doesn't go, aha, you're back, you've come here, and I thought I'd thwarted you my unique ways. The only part where it gets close to that, where he makes it personal, is when he tries to put a wedge between Celes and the rest of them by saying that she's been working for us. But that's not because he's doing the whole trope of, oh, actually, this will weaken you. He's doing it because he knows it's like an engineering thing. It's like I know that this will create a break with them. It's not based off empathy. It's based off of the way of him like going, no, this will stop him. It adds to his writing as a brilliant villain. It's just it's more difficult to hate him. You know what I mean? It's just he's just evil.
So there is one thing that I do briefly want to mention as well. Emperor Gestalt, obviously he's kind of a bit of a non-character, really. You have an interaction with him in the capital of the Empire, and you have dinner with him, which was
yes, you do,
really bizarre. I understand exactly where they were going with that, but whatever. So Gestalt as a character is pretty non-existent. They've kind of introduced him in Final Fantasy XIV as well, but not in the way that you're thinking. Gestalt himself isn't a character that's been like copy-pasted over. Gestalt is a minion.
He's a doggo.
Yep, Emperor Gestalt has been transposed into Final Fantasy XIV as a little dog with big fluffy ears that follows you around, which was just the most wonderful thing to learn, honestly. That really made me laugh when I first found them.
I think my point about the villains in this game is that they are one-dimensional. They're evil and bad. And I think when I say put them in the top 10 of my list, it's more difficult to talk. Ironically, we've been talking about Kefka for a while now, but it's more difficult to talk about the nuance of what drives a character. Like you say, he's insane and he's bad. Gestalt is just a generic emperor. That works in the story. It's good and it's good writing. It's just, it's the whole
when you
thing
take them out of context, they're not really much to write home about, really.
And I think that it's probably the weakest version of that trope in Final Fantasy of I was the real villain all along. Because when the Emperor gets taken out, it's like, from Kefka's perspective, like he is a wild card, he's flipping the table. That's brilliant. But it's like, no, okay, just kill the Emperor. And what? You know what I mean? I don't give a shit because I don't really care. He's just a generic, it could have been anyone, It's, I wouldn't say disappointing. It's just this, obviously a lot of other Final Fantasies have, I was the real villain all along. And it's like, wow, okay, that's really cool. Like you were pulling someone's strings. It was.
I don't even really want to call Gestalt like a missed opportunity because there isn't really much for him to do within the actual realm of the game itself. Like, I'm fine with the way the villains in 6 were written, and trying to think of a different way to handle the things that they do is kind of impossible.
It wouldn't work in the context of the game because effectively they are evil. The other characters, every other character in the game is a shade of grey. And the only way to have that work is if you have the villains just be completely one-dimensional. There's a scene earlier on where we talk about the poisoning of Doma. Gestalt has to get General Leo out of the way to get away with doing it. So that actually creates a situation where they know that everyone else that works for them is not just evil and we are the evil world. And again, the villain is the Empire. That's done really, really well in the narrative as well, where I can't remember the name of the continent, but you go into Figaro Castle, which is cool, by the way. You go underground, go to the other continent, fabulous. And you go to that continent and the capital, which is Vector, I believe it's called.
That's it, yes.
Everyone you speak to there is like, yeah, I'm pro Empire, I'm pro Empire. You go to like 2 or 3 other towns around the area, which at this point in the game have no narrative significance, really. The only reason to go to them other than to get some items is that they're all just saying, God, I hate the Empire, God, I hate the Empire. And it builds up this hatred for the Empire. It's not, I hate Gustol and Kefka's a twat. It's the Empire edicts, and this is how the Empire have fought us. And that goes further into the point of Printer Ink Cyan having angst against Sellers because she's a general from the Empire. It takes them a while to get over that because she's on the bad team as opposed to working for Gustol or anything like that, you know?
Yeah. So before we move on to your big topic, which I know you're very excited to get onto, I do really want to talk about the Warring Triad themselves, actually, which is the catalyst for breaking up the world of balance and turning everything into shit. I really don't know how I feel about the Warring Triad, actually. I enjoy them from a perspective of, okay, there are these big, like, arcane eldritch things that are hidden, and if they're moved, everything goes to shit. That's fine. I like that, actually. I think it's, and I say this with all the love of my heart, it's very hard for me to suspend my disbelief to know that they are supposed to be the gods of magic and the things that created the Espers. And then after they had a war, they sealed themselves away and were like, hey, make sure no one ever touches us. Because one, the Espers didn't do a very good fucking job of that. And two, it's like, okay, like, why was the only way for them to stop fighting to seal themselves away? Why couldn't they just stop fighting? It breaks my immersion just a little bit, and I hate saying that in a game where, you know, you've got a castle that can go under the desert to a different continent. It's a bit stupid.
Yeah, no, really. It's a different tone, isn't it? It's not the same silly castle can go under the desert and something a bit silly, or a flying octopus, or that's reasonable. Yeah, no, you're right. It's sort of just like a non-entity to me. You know, my take on the Triad was that it was more of a meta reference to Zelda. That's what it felt like to me. You know, because there's a Triad in Zelda, and I think it's more of like a generic fantasy story. Is that they were again poking at that or ribbing on it? It just seemed like such a small part of the narrative to me that I didn't really have an opinion on it. Other than, I can see where you're coming from.
That's fair. Like, it's one of those things of like, it probably wouldn't have stood out to me so much if the preceding battle before you actually get there is with Ultima Weapon, which is this whole, like, it was created to protect it, basically. And it's like, okay, why? I'm like, I get why, but like, if this was such a big deal, then why didn't you do it differently? It's just one of those things that makes me scratch my head a bit.
Yeah, it's a little bit.
However, really like one piece of magicite which you can get in the game, which is supposed to be a fragment of the Warring Triad's power. Do you know which magicite this is?
I don't. Which one is it?
Okay, it's had a few different names over the years. I believe it's now known as Crusader, also known as Jihad, also known as Doomsday. So it's had a few names over the years.
Yes.
I think the original Japanese name is Doomsday. Yes, that's exactly it. I believe that Holy War attack has also been renamed to Cleansing, and their summon attack is supposed to depict the battle between the three aspects of the Warring Triad. It's functionally a useless piece of magicite because it will kill your party as well as foes, which I really enjoy from a meta standpoint, I suppose, of like, this is how bad the war between the three gods. What would you call them? The Warring Triad was, just because like there is nothing that didn't get caught in the crossfire. Like, it was right for them to be sealed away. But by the way, here's a little piece of their magic.
Yeah.
You can learn from that magicite the magic Meteor and Meltdown, which are historically two of the most powerful spells within the Final Fantasy franchise, which I do like as well. But I almost feel like you shouldn't be able to learn anything from it. Like, that magic is just so advanced that no one should really have any aspect of the Warring Triad, you know?
Do you think it would have made more narrative sense if they'd had each one of them give you a bit of magicite, and one of them be Thundergirl, one of them be Blizzardgirl, and one of them be Firegirl? And
I would have really liked that.
That would have tied more in with the whole, you know, like effectively then what you would have had is, because I think Terra has been infused with
Fire Terra,
Sellers is Blizzard, and I presume that Leo is Thunder. Like, that would I
don't recall, but that would make sense.
Like the point, it would have made more sense if they'd had that. But you know, I get your point. That's interesting, because it didn't really resonate with me at all when I played it, because I was so annoyed.
That's the thing. The Warring Triad is just one of those things that's not that important overall, but like it is, but it isn't. It's important to the world, but it's not important to you, the player. There is one other thing that I'd want to mention as well. In the Game Boy Advance version,
the extra dungeons,
the extra dungeon that they implemented, I think this is in every single release of the game, but there are 8 legendary dragons which are released when the world ruin is broken up.
Fucking wind dragon, man.
There's 1 dragon for every elemental aspect. By the way, poison is apparently an element in this game, which, okay, that's a weird element, but pop off. After all of the 8 dragons are killed in the Game Boy Advance version, you get a bonus dungeon which opens up with Kaiser Dragon, which looks an awful lot like Shinryu, which I adore anyway. Kaiser Dragon is Final Fantasy VI's like big super boss, and it drops a Magicite. Do you know which Magicite?
No, I don't.
It's your boy Diablos.
Oh, is it? Oh my god, really? I need to get the Game Boy Advance version. I need to get it.
Good luck if you do want to fight Kaiser Dragon, though. It has 5 lives. Each of them have over 65,000 health, and it casts Ultima when it's killed. By the way, monsters that cast a thing when they die can all fuck off. I know at the very top of is it the cult tower? Not Kefka's tower, the cult tower. There's an enemy that also casts Ultima. I could never beat that because Ultima would wipe me out as well. It's like, fuck off, man. Just I
haven't managed to beat the wind dragon yet because it's a fucking nightmare. It's so hard. It's annoying as well because it's the first one you run into if you follow the narrative, because they're all optional. You've got to go and get Kyan from his flipping weird man writing letter cave, and on the way there you bump into the wind dragon, and it's just fucking nigh on impossible. But yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. Like, when I was playing this game, I thought, I'm never going to be able to beat all these flipping optional bosses. I want to, but like the amount of effort I have to put in to do them is just fucking insane. But yeah, that's cool. Poor old Game Boy Advance version. I mean, that's one of the things about the pixel remasters that people have complained about, is the extra content isn't in them. But I think it is probably the best way to play the games. I mean, the pixel remaster, just to talk about that briefly, it's beautiful. I think
looks a hell of a lot better than the mobile and Steam version.
Oh god, don't talk to me about them. Oh god.
By the way, why are all of the screenshots on the Final Fantasy wiki from the 2014 version? They are all ugly as sin. Yeah. It's horrible. Disgraceful.
It's interesting. I mentioned right at the beginning about the different ports. I mean, that is a pretty ugly one, but the pixel remaster uses the Game Boy Advance maps as a base, which is why they're so much brighter. Okay. Some people complain about that it should be darker like the original SNES version, but I think it works really well in being bright because it makes it pop somewhat. Because obviously in the Game Boy Advance they had to make them brighter for hardware limitations. I mean, yeah, I've never actually played the Game Boy Advance version, probably because it cost £8 million, like you say.
Yeah.
I think I've got the Game Boy Advance version of every other Final Fantasy apart from that one. But yeah, again, very briefly before we move on to the last bit, which I'm really bigging up now, which probably might fall flat, is that the dungeon design in this game is, we've talked about, I think it was in the FF1 and 2 episode, about how only the first 3 games are dungeon crawlers and that changes as time goes on. But I think this is unique in a sense that the dungeon and town design is just so well done. I mean, there's so many secret passages you have behind and stuff like that. Yeah. And I remember that blew my mind when I first played it. I mean, it was just so cool that you could like exit a cave and go around through the mines and come back out the front of the town. Yeah. And that's consistent throughout the game. They don't just get bored. I mean, it feels like in some of the golden era games we mentioned before, 7, 8, and 9, that like some of the dungeons were really, really well put together, and some of them just felt like they were slapped together at the last minute with a lick of paint, like the fire cavern at the beginning of Final Fantasy 8.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it is the first cave, but it's just a corridor of fire, nothing to it. Whereas like in this game, the Phoenix Cave, we have to have 2 parties to get through it. There's a few other ones where you need, there's certain puzzles you need to do. All of them seem like they're well thought out. They're not amazingly deep puzzles, but they are all clever little puzzles that tie in. I think it's really, really good. So worth mentioning that. And it's almost like they peaked with this game with that and then didn't go back to doing it again,
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I can't really think of too many other, I mean, obviously it's kind of changed now in the modern era with 15 and 16 particularly, because they're more open world. You can actually like explore a bit and stuff. But yeah, with other games, it's very much like you have a set background and you're not deviating from this at all.
What I have to mention though, now you've just said open world.
Okay.
And again, just how ahead of its time this game was. The first game feels like a linear progression story, and the second game feels like an open world game. And this came out in 1994. Like, before open world games were really a thing. It does
Eat your heart out, Skyrim.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this, to be fair, this is probably the most influential RPG ever made. Like, it's just, you can't, I think that can be denied. I think it's probably more influential than 7. Even if people argue that 7's better or whatever, this is...
It's really interesting because I don't disagree with you whatsoever, but there's something about the way that the story is actually laid out. Like, 6 is fantastic from start to finish. Its story makes sense. There's not a single thing about it that I would change, except for, Cyan being creepy in a cave. But
I'm glad we
ultimately,
agree on that.
ultimately, it's Seven's story which stuck with me more.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I can
And
see
I
that.
really wouldn't be able to explain why. I don't know. Like, it's not that the characters were less personable than the characters of Seven. It's not that the overall look of the world was less inviting, or because they're two very, very different games. It would be unfair to compare them. But there's something about Six, which, while it is incredibly influential, I absolutely cannot deny that at all. Like, there's something about it which just didn't ingrain itself in my head the
No.
same way that other
I,
titles
I
did.
think a lot of that is to do with the fact that it's not 3D. I think that the
Yeah.
3D-ness, and then all, if you look at we talked about it before with the iconic image of Cloud with a sword over his head,
Mm-hmm.
and that being in game shops everywhere. It was relatable. You could look at that character and see them as an actual functioning human being. In this game,
That's a really good point,
they've
actually.
never really done that. It's almost like I think it makes sense because this game wouldn't work as a 3D game because all that silly stuff with Ultros behind a bloody counter in the Colosseum and flying in the air and suplexing a train would not work in a 3D game. Just has to be sort of left as the peak of 2D Final Fantasy. So I think I agree with you. There are moments that I think we'll get to the moment that really resonates now. But yeah, you're right. I don't
Go
think
on, Jack. Take it
right,
away.
Okay. So what do you think I'm going to say the best moment in the game is?
Is it the opera,
It's the
Jack? Are you
fucking
talking
opera.
about the opera?
So we sort of touched upon Sellers, but Sellers is an absolute badass, and I love her. Right, she's my favorite character in the game by a country mile. She's so good.
I got that sense. Yeah.
So she's a defector. So she's obviously seen to struggle with her relationships we talked about, and then Locke wins her over because he's the only person that treats her like a human being as opposed to like an object. And I really, really, really like that because Locke isn't treating her, like I say, as the damsel in distress, like Zidane does with Princess Garnet in Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah.
He wants to protect her, but he treats her like she's a bit silly and a bit stupid. It works in that story, but Locke wants to save her by helping her be herself, which is so refreshing for a male character in a game, and obviously a female character as well. And the opera kind of like, again, the opera being beautiful as a piece of music on its own, but it's incredible because what the narrative storyline of that is that they want to get Setzer's airship. Okay, it's a bit weird that Setzer wants to abduct a girl in the opera, but it works as well. It's a bit silly. It's a bit like theatrical. You don't think,
it's the whole.
Setzer's
if you
creepy.
took out the silly bits, Six just wouldn't work.
Yeah,
the same way.
It's silly. I don't at any point think Setzer's a creep. It felt like he wants to kidnap Maria because he wants to be seen doing it, not because he wants to upset that character. It's a bit bizarre. But the whole point is that they know that Setzer's going to kidnap Maria. Maria's, I think, ill or dead or whatever. And somehow Sellers looks exactly like Maria, which is completely ridiculous. Like,
thank God for coincidences. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, it's some irony there that Terror and Sellers look the same when they're blonde. Yeah, so up to this point in the game, Sellers has been the soldier archetype, very similar to Beatrix, actually, and Cecil from Final Fantasy IV. Like obviously her story arc is redemption from being part of the evil empire's plans. What's different about her than Cecil and Beatrix, who I've just realized are actually very, very similar, is that you don't see her having a change of heart. You only see the aftermath of that.
Yeah, Sellers is very much to use the phrase, a defrosting ice queen on screen at like all times, really.
Yeah, exactly. Really
it takes a long time, don't get me wrong, but like you can see every single step of that journey.
But it's a good balance because, the trope it seems to be that she has to do the opera scene. So she has to go for more of an artistic thing when she's actually a soldier. Now, it's interesting because her design is quite feminine. She's not like in some ways like Lightning is. I mean, obviously Lightning has a feminine design, but Lightning's very stoic and very like, you wouldn't catch her doing an opera quite the same way, depending on how many. I've not played all the Final Fantasy 13 Master Film. Maybe there is that. Maybe somewhere there is. Yeah, there is, isn't there? Of course there is. But you see my point is that is probably in that game, whatever one it is, it's more surprising when she does, because the whole point of this is that, like, I think Locke says to her, "Oh, you didn't realize you were so pretty." That's not surprising because of her character design. What I love about it is that she steps out and does the opera scene and nails it. And that ties into the whole thing of like, Locke's in awe of her, the characters are in awe of her. They're not looking at her as this damsel in distress that is doing something that she struggles with. She just goes out, treats it like a job because she's a soldier, and nails it. And I think that is so powerful, like that whole scene, because of the fact it's like basically she's doing something that's more artistic and more creative and away from her norm, but she's also very, very good at it. she doesn't see how impactful it is. And I think it blew my mind watching it. I thought it was incredibly well done.
I think there's also something to be said in, like, because it's an artistic feat rather than a military one, it probably goes some way to actually defrosting Sellers as well. Like, she's finally put herself in the shoes of doing something that's just so removed from everything that she's ever done before that it doesn't really have that much of an impact on her in the moment or even after the moment. Like, the opera scene is never really talked about ever again in the game, but it's a really big point for her character to step into and, like, okay, well, fine, I'll do it. And you get the sense that, okay, it might just be a job for her. It might just be a means to get from point A to point B. But even so, like, the fact that she does it is like no one else was stepping up to do it. I mean, no one else looked like Maria either, but like no one else was going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. She does it, but it's also really cool because eventually then she gets put in kidnapped by Setzer eventually, and then put in the room on the blackjack, and then literally straight away she just like rolls the ladder down and gets everyone to come in, and it's back to business. There's very little. I think there's a comment made about like, oh, I'm not just an opera or whatever or something like that.
I'm not some opera floozy. I'm
not some opera floozy. I'm a general. Yeah, exactly. So she's kind of like, oh God, I've got to do this, but it's not made a joke later in the story. It's not like, oh, you get out of those clothes then. Oh God, I can't wait to get these off. It's just like, I've done that. It's part of my job. Now I can do that's a skill I now have, and it's really, really, really well written in that sense. And I don't know if you've seen the Pixel remaster version of the opera.
I haven't actually. Is it as good as I'm hoping it is?
My God!
Because the original opera scene was fantastic anyway.
Well, I think it's brilliant. It's just so well done. It's in English. The male voice is clearly an opera singer, but Sellers, i.e. Maria, is not an opera singer or less operatic. It's just so good. And of course, the whole theme of the actual opera, it ties in with the main story, and I just think it's excellent. I think that the fact that again Locke has to go and save Sellers from Ultros, and she effectively becomes the damsel in distress, but she's not the damsel in distress. She's playing the role as a damsel in distress. It's just so meta. Yeah. It's just they have to rescue her, and it doesn't maybe go, oh, here we go, the woman's got to be rescued by the blokes again. It works, and it doesn't make her any. And then of course, eventually she lets them all in, and is part of the plan. So they're equals. I think it's just brilliant. And of course, the opera itself, I saw it at Distant Worlds in London back in 2018. Oh my God.
We must have been at the same concert then, because they had actual opera singers out. They had the opera singers on stage. I was in the pit. It's
the one where Nobu was there. It was before 2017. Definitely, it was 2017 or before. Definitely. What a moving, and of course they had the whole scenes of the opera in the background.
Yeah, my favorite point, because I've been to Distant Worlds 3 times now. On twice of those, they've actually performed the opera, and both times when it's time for the vocals cut out and it's the actual like the strings, the conductor always turns around to the audience and it's the impresario on the screen doing the conducting stick, and it always cracks me up when I see that.
Fabulous. That's probably the peak. I mean, of their relationship, Sellers and Locke, I think it's the best love story in the series. We've talked about it before, how Final Fantasy VIII is the more awkward, realistic relationship stuff. Final Fantasy IX is, I think we said, it's the more romantic, the way it's remembered when you're older type thing, more romantic. Whereas this is just guttural and real. It's like,
I think something that I really enjoy about it is that it's not particularly overt either. Like, it's definitely intended to be read a certain way, but if you don't want to read it that way, it doesn't really change anything. Locke still comes back to the party. Locke and Sally still obviously mean a lot to each other. It's just you don't have to read it that way, which I really appreciate. Actually,
they built their relationship from mutual respect as opposed to just like, I fancy you. Yeah, again, that's done so well in Final Fantasy IX particularly, but here, like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's just like how those two characters are tied together. I mean, you've got the scene where Sellers is tied up in the South Figaro dungeon, which I think is censored in every version of the game apart from the SNES version, because they actually start beating her up, which is like, I mean, it's probably a little bit too much. And she's kind of like sees Locke as the only, like, he's the only person that really believes in her as a person. She probably hates herself for things she's done in the past. And she clearly has very low self-esteem. And of course, when he doubts her for a split second later in the game, that completely destroys her world. And it's sort of like, it actually impacts the narrative of the game. And their sort of fallout is like part of it. And I think that ties in with what I said before about how, the important characters aren't necessarily in the narrative. It's more about what they don't say to each other than what they do in this game.
Yeah. That's a really good way of looking at it, actually, because there is a lot of the silence that can be filled in with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene at some point where he goes to say, I'm really, really sorry. And of course, Locke's character is, as we talked about before, he's in a sense trying to revive his lost love that he feels like he's let down. And he's doing whatever he can to not let Sellers down. But she's also very much detached because of her past. And so it's a really realistic relationship between two people, let alone, two people that are attracted to each other. It's just a very real relationship. And I just think it's brilliant. I think it's just so, it's not like, oh, I'm going to get the, like say, read a romance novel thing. And this is really, it's just guttural and real, and I love it. I think it's fantastic. And again, the scene we mentioned before about how when she decides she's going to move on is seeing Locke's bandana on the beach. I think that's just to die for, because of course at this point in the story, I think she mentions in the opera scene that he mentions about, oh, you remind me of Rachel, I think it is, isn't it? And she's like, I think she says something to the effect of, am I just a replacement for her or something to him? I think the scene we mentioned earlier on the beach of the attempted suicide, and she then sees Locke's bandana. I think it's really, really good, because it doesn't matter to her what he thinks of her. It's about what she thinks of him. And I think that's fabulous. I think it's brilliant.
It really gives you a sense of, if she went to Locke directly after that moment and confessed and he said, no, I'm not interested, you kind of get the feeling that it wouldn't matter. She would just need to get that off her chest to begin with anyway, and then she could carry on.
Yeah,
you're right. It's strong in its own way.
It's separate to the romance, because I think it's clearly very, very, very strongly implied that they become a couple.
Yeah.
But it's not important that they have that scene at the end. The fact that their relationship is repaired on a respect level is brilliant, and they basically bring each other back from the brink, don't they? Which is just brilliant. It's like
in a game where the tone is so dark and depressing, and the world of ruin is so fractured, and everyone is giving up. Like, isn't that the kind of thing that you want to see? People being able to repair their relationships with one another and find a better future together.
It's kind of, I think I asked you a question before, who's the main character? There isn't one, but Sellers, I think, becomes the main character in that I think Locke has rubbed off on her because he believes in people and wants them to get the best out of them that they can. And she starts behaving like Locke when she starts to bring everyone round. It's good that she becomes the character that has to rescue everyone else and bring them back round. She's filling Locke's role. Which is
from a character that previously wouldn't have been able to do that is
exactly
a huge step too.
And of course that is again probably the fact that Final Fantasy IX is kind of a throwback to all the other games in the series. That's probably borrowed from this game somewhat. I think it's done better here. I certainly prefer Sellers to Dagger in Final Fantasy IX. Yeah, Zidane's not as good a version of Locke. It's just a young version of Locke, isn't he?
With a tail.
With a tail.
So before we move on to our wildcard topics, there's one very important thing that we haven't mentioned. The music.
Oh yeah, well we talked about the opera, didn't we? But yeah, the music, it's one of the best soundtracks, isn't it? It's fucking incredible.
It is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it is maybe Uematsu's greatest work.
I think it probably is.
I don't say that very lightly, because all of Uematsu's work is his greatest work.
No,
quite frankly.
I think the design, how it's brought into the world is brilliant as well. How like the character motifs, the opera, the melodies of the opera is Sellers' theme, and how that comes up at her points in the story. The same with like when Locke's on the screen. It's just so Terra's theme. It's all just, who's on the screen when it's happening, and what that theme of music means to the story.
I think it all helps that it's all really catchy in a way that I wouldn't normally say about a soundtrack either. It's iconic in that, other than leitmotifs, there's nothing that really repeats. It sticks in your head, like just in a way that I don't have the language for, because I'm not a musician. I'm not a music person, unfortunately. And it goes without saying that Dancing Mad might be the best song of the entire franchise, dare I say.
I think I read somewhere that like Nobuo was wanted to leave the series and they let him go to town on this game. Because he wanted to write opera or something. I think that's, I mean, that might, that's what I've read somewhere. It might not be true, it might be true, but I think I'm quite musical. I think there's lots of leitmotif that's established with different characters in the game. Obviously, I'm not going to hum them, but like Sellers' theme is really, really obvious. Shadow's theme as well, with the sort of like, Western sounding stuff. It's if you were to play all the bits of music to me from Final Fantasy VI, I would probably be able to tell you what it was about and what it was representing. I mean, there's the Magitech facility as well. That's incredible, that piece of music.
Yeah.
And also the bass on the flipping World of Ruin theme on the world map is just fucking fantastic. I also like, again, the sound direction. There's been a couple of times in Final Fantasy where they've not quite got that right. So, for example, on Final Fantasy VIII, on the world map theme at the beginning of the game is called Blue Fields, and then it stays like that through the rest of the game. There's a piece of music called Compression of Time, which plays when you first go into the room where all the save points appear, and then go to the time compression. A lot of people say that should be the world map post-time compression music. It never was. I agree. It probably should have been as well. The same, there's another one that kind of escapes me at the moment where, so in Final Fantasy IX, there's a piece of music called, there's a place called Fossil Roo. The music only plays for like 3 or 4 seconds because
which is such a shame because Fossil Brew is a great soundtrack.
30 seconds later, you're into the Gargant area and it plays the Gargant music, which is good music, but it doesn't play that theme. I think they should have kept that through the dungeon. So there's a few moments like that in Final Fantasy where they should have, the sound, the music direction should be better. Whereas perfect in this game. I mean, I mentioned before about the scene with Locke and Sellers where he winks at the camera and says, "Let's go," and then I think it's Locke's theme starts playing, and it's just like, wow, like the emotion that comes out of that is just absolutely to die for, And again, I think that's something worth noting as well, that the emotive nature of all the different characters have got their own design and their own idle animations, and they all enter battle differently, adds to their characterization as well. And I think that probably makes it the peak of the 2D era. It's probably why it'd be very, very difficult to remake in 3D. Imagine what Ultros would look like. Probably like Abomination that was in Final Fantasy 15 Kingslave. Imagine that.
That's not the only time that they've brought Ultros to 3D, is the thing. He's in Final Fantasy 13 too, and he's in Final Fantasy 14 as well. He looks a lot better than he did in 15, though, so don't worry.
I just think it's hilarious. He's behind a desk. He got himself a desk job, good old Ultros. Ulti, as Realm calls him.
Uncle Ulti.
Uncle Ulti. Dear. Right, okay, so that's not it from Final Fantasy 6, but that's it from the main topic this week. So, my wildcard subject is glitches.
Oh boy.
I think Final Fantasy VI absorbed me so much the last few weeks that I couldn't really think of anything else to write about. So I thought, you know what, I'll talk about. And to be fair, this needs its own topic. So I'm going to talk about the first glitch. Do you know what the first glitch I'm going to talk about is?
Oh God, there's so many to pick from. Is the thing. I couldn't tell you.
The first one is the sketch glitch.
Okay.
Right. So one of the most infamous glitches in Final Fantasy series is the sketch glitch or bug, mostly because it can be triggered in normal play and have dramatic effect. So the character Realm has an ability called Sketch, which we talked about briefly, where she sketches or paints the target and sort of reverse Ono cards them and throws their ability back at them. If this misses in the original SNES version, sometimes it can lead to corrupted save data. Because the reason that is, without getting too technical, the sprite data is trying to be loaded from the wrong place in the ROM. So it ends up, it's in a really weird configuration. If you've got silence in one place or something like that, what it can do is it can create like loads of items in your inventory that just say at my weapon, or it can bin your save file off. Now, notably, the Angry Video Game Nerd did a video on Final Fantasy VI last Christmas. He played the game as a kid and talked before about how his game corrupted when he was young, and it's because of this glitch. Because and of course the thing is with it as well, if you play the game again, unless you've done the exact same thing, it might not trigger again. It's like basically don't use Realm in the original version. And it was fixed in like the second version of the SNES game. It's like the second print of it. So like a year in. So if you were unlucky enough to have one of the first early prints of the game, that would happen. And it's one of those things where it's probably, I mean, I don't know because I never had the SNES version of the game, which probably been one of those things where people have been like, my game did this. And everyone's like, what are you on about? You're talking nonsense. But as time's gone on, that's been revealed as being true. There's a user called Master Z who has a guide about this bug, which was last updated in 2005, so nearly 20 years ago, but then 10 years after the game, 10, 11 years after the game came out. But I thought the contents were quite funny, worth mentioning, because one of them is why the bug occurs for casual gamers. And the next one is why the bug occurs for the SNES technical know-it-all. I just thought that's really funny. There's two different sections. Like you could just see the guys clearly gone, what's going on with this? And spend hours working it out, which I think is fascinating because it really ties into the, I've mentioned before how I think games at their best are the perfect balance between art and engineering, which is why I love them so much. The fact that some of these glitches can be exploited to help with speedrunning, or they can be exploited and stuff like that over time is really, really cool. Or they may make an accidental thing that only happens in your game that no one else knows about. Nowadays, you can go online and find, why has this happened? And then someone can either tell you or go, oh my God, I didn't realize that, and then go and test it themselves, which is really interesting. Back in the day, it was like, did that just happen? Did I just see that? You had
to really, really scrape the memory banks to figure out what you're doing.
A couple more from other Final Fantasy games. One from Final Fantasy VII. Do you know what I'm going to mention in that game?
Is this the W item glitch?
It is the W item glitch. That's the W item duplication bug, as it's written on some site I found, which allows the player to obtain large quantities of certain items. The W item command Materia allows the player to use two of the same type of item in battle, which can be done by using the technique to select an item, cancel it, and then select another one, and then cancel that, which can be done up to 99 times for each item. So I remember someone at school, going back a bit, turn around and saying to me, you can get 99 of each item, and that's the way to beat the game. And I remember thinking, like, how was that possible? It's like you can get 99 ribbons, and it was like, what are you on about? Like, that's just like there's only like 3 of them or whatever in the game. But yeah, if you've got like a year of time to burn, you can go and do that. If you really want to go make a perfect game, Final Fantasy 7, I don't think I'll be doing that.
I don't remember how I actually learned about the W item glitch when I was younger. I have very fond memories of doing that when I was young in primary school. I do know that the last time that I actually did a playthrough of Final Fantasy VII, I was streaming it for a friend on Discord, and I got told off using the W item glitch, which I thought was very unfair. If it's in the game, I should be allowed to exploit it.
It's interesting because, like, I mentioned speedrunning briefly, and Final Fantasy VII has about 4 or 5, or maybe even more, different like categories for speedrunning, because like you get like different platforms. So like, for example, Final Fantasy 9 has a speedrun on PlayStation 1, has a speedrun on the remastered version, that kind of stuff. And you can get things called any percent, and any percent is you basically beat the game in any percentage, and you've got 100% runs and that sort of stuff. Final Fantasy 7's got loads of different ones because of, you know, no glitches and like there's loads of games that are like that. It's what I find fascinating about speedrunning is that you find a different way to beat the game and no one shuns you for it. I'm sure there are people that do shun you, but like there's this like, you know, that's a different category as opposed to no, you're not allowed to do that. It's like, well, you can do that, but have your own box you can go in. I think that's quite cool. Another completely useless one is in Final Fantasy 8. Do you know what one I'm going to talk about in Final Fantasy 8?
Oh, I didn't realize there were glitches for
There
8,
are one or two in 8. I mean, one I'll mention briefly, which is useful, is on the Timber Train mission. You can glitch behind the door and get past Watson's zone and go into the briefing first, and you skip having to meet Renoa. So it saves about 5 minutes. Yeah. and on the AGGQ 2020 run, which happened just before COVID, which is a run of Final Fantasy 8 where they have Mutski, who I've spoken to before, and a few other guys basically tag team the run and beat it in like 9 or so hours, I think. And there's a part, I mean, worth watching because they all sing "Eyes on Me," which is fantastic. It's hilarious, but it's like quite like, wow, you know, this is a really emotive moment because everyone's like happy together. It's really cool. But they explain how you can do that, but they don't do it because part of speedrunning for ADGQ is you're allowed to name the characters. So if you put in like a certain amount of money against naming them a certain thing, so they had to name Renoa and Angelo. If you do that, you miss naming Renoa and Angelo. And they name them all sorts of silly things, which is really, really cool. I like that. But the glitch I want to talk about briefly is the Balam Garden balcony glitch.
God, okay.
So it's really pretty unspectacular. So after the garden has become mobile and you're sent up on deck to basically see it flying and look at the beautiful, seamless FMV versus the gameplay, which Final Fantasy VIII did so well. If Renoa is in the party, apparently it's slightly longer. And if the player gets too close to the door before the FMV ends, you're stuck on the balcony.
I see.
And it's something to do with the fact the FMV and the real game are happening at the same time. So basically you can get it, so you're stuck on the balcony. Completely useless. Doesn't
wonderful.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so yeah, I only learned about that one today. So just because I thought I'd pad it out a little bit with some extra little glitches because I didn't want to just talk about Final Fantasy VI. But the last glitch is not Final Fantasy. It is, you mentioned before about the W item glitch and how that's synonymous with playing the game and remembering it in primary school. Probably because it was in games magazines or it was in the culture in some ways. A lot of these glitches have only really been discovered because of people emulating the game and cracking it open in various different ways. But the big one for me as a kid was Pokemon. So in Pokemon Gold, you could clone Pokemon. If you were to deposit a Pokemon in the box and then turn it off before the game saved, you would have 2 copies of that Pokemon. And it was a good way of cloning rare candies items. You could attach them on the Pokemon and then get multiple items. And I do remember like someone said, you can just clone Pokemon, telling me how you did it. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. Like the opposite is you. Like I remember turning around to my mum and being like, am I allowed to do this? Is it right? And she was like,
the
what are you talking
Pokemon
about?
police might get me.
Yeah, because I thought that's not right. You shouldn't be able to do that, you know. And it's not, you know, it's totally crazy. But yeah, it's interesting how these things tie. I think Pokemon's obviously got quite a few, especially the first game where you could get Mew into the game and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, am I allowed to do this? And it just, you know, there's probably loads more. And I'd love to delve into the Final Fantasy glitches because 6 is so many. As time's gone on, there's less and less of them. I mean, there's a couple of other ones, like an 8, where you can, if you move the stick in the scripted scene where you go into the Dollet mission, the car, you can make the car face left. And just silly little things that you can do that have no bearing on anything, but they're just, you know, it's just interesting how people have discovered them, you know. So that's it from me.
Good. Thank you. My wildcard topic today, I'm going to be going back to my childhood, actually, as I suspect a lot of people probably will have done with Final Fantasy VI, since it was, as you say, 30 years ago. I'm not going to forgive you for saying that.
No, sorry, I do it every week. I do it every single time we talk. and make us feel old.
So the game that I'm going to be talking about today is a rhythm game from '99, which came out in PAL regions in 2000. However, it didn't come out for the North American audiences in the same year. That came out much later, and only because I think the CEO of PlayStation at the time was like, he mentioned the title and everyone was like, are we finally getting it? No, they weren't. So they hurriedly released it for the PlayStation Network, I think in 2010. This game is called Vib Ribbon. Have you ever heard of
I've
it?
heard of Vib Ribbon. Yeah.
I thought you, with your PlayStation collection, might have
I
done.
don't have Vib Ribbon, but I've certainly heard of Vib Ribbon. Yeah.
So this was a game that I actually grew up playing with my
Oh,
dad.
really?
Yes, my dad had a PlayStation 1 when I was younger. Obviously, when I was younger. My dad has always been the kind of person to search out the strangest games, the strangest like albums that he can find, usually based on like just album artwork or names of things, and pick them up and play them. He was how I discovered the Katamari series, because he found that one day and was like, this looks weird as shit. Let's play it. Okay. Brilliant games, by the way.
Yeah.
So I suspect Vib Ribbon was probably another one of those kinds of things. What's Vib Ribbon? I don't know. Let's buy it and play it. In Vib Ribbon, you play a completely 2D vector-based rabbit. And when I say 2D, I mean completely 2D. This is a completely black and white game. The only white is Vibri, the main character rabbit, which is you, and the path that she walks on. Vibri only travels in one direction, to the right, at different speeds, and you take control of her by going over obstacles or under obstacles by pressing any one of 4 buttons or combination of 4 buttons to jump over these obstacles. There is something so wonderful about this game, not just because of my nostalgia glasses, but because it is so very simple. I think there are only 7 tracks in the game that you can actually play with. There's a bronze stage, there's a silver stage, and there's a gold stage. And obviously, the more stages that you play, the higher the difficulty increases and the more complicated objects that you have to traverse. But the real selling point for this game is that the game itself actually operates mostly off of the ROM system within the PlayStation itself. So you can open up the case, pop out the disc, and put in any music CD and play those tracks in Vib Ribbon. We had so much fun as a kid putting in whatever like CDs that we could find. I can't remember most of the ones that we actually put in, but I know it might have been like a Muse CD or something, and it was unplayable. My absolute favorite of all time was we had the CD version of Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite.
Oh, fabulous.
We put that in, and there was just nothing on one of these tracks for like the longest time because they're so quiet, and there was like this one like boom, and there was one thing on the entire track, and it's like this half-hour long. It just,
that's brilliant.
Remembering that really cracked me up.
Yeah.
To extend this just a little bit as well, I learned that Nana Onsha, who was the producer for Vib Ribbon, were the same people that produced Parappa the Rapper and Jammer Lammy, which were, I think most everyone has heard of Parappa the Rapper, to my eternal chagrin. This is a call and response kind of rapping game, which came out in '96. I didn't realize Parappa was that old. I've only ever played the sequel, Jammer Lammy, which came out in 1999. It follows the same kind of strange 2D, very colorful world. It's still a call and response rhythm game, but rather than rapping, the main character Lammy, who is a ram, I believe she's meant to be, as in like, yeah, I think so, she plays her guitar. The whole plot of the game is Lammy and her band have a concert that they're due to put on in 15 minutes. Lammy has overslept, and by the time she's made it out of the door and like down the street, she's realized she's forgotten her guitar, and then everyone in town just gets in the fucking way. This was another game that I grew up playing, and I absolutely adore it. The songs are to die for.
Let's get on.
I frequently get that song stuck in my head.
Yep.
I do believe that I used to say as a kid that Milk Can was my favorite band in the world because I just enjoyed the music that much. I did sadly learn recently that Michelle Banks, the voice of Katy Cat, died in 2016. She was the vocalist for the band Milk Can. So I think one of the things that I do notice on like a lot of Milk Can videos or OSTs for Jammer Lammy now is just like, you know, I didn't know that she worked in anything else, but she was the voice of my childhood. So it was actually really nice to see a lot of other people had actually played that game despite no one ever really knowing what Jammer Lammy is. I don't know what happened to it, but I used to have a Master Onion t-shirt
Oh,
somewhere.
really?
I think I bought it from Redbubble. I wore it out in public one time, and one guy stopped me and was like, "Where do I know that guy from?" And I was like, "You know it from Parappa the Rapper." And he was like, "Yes!" And I'm like, "I don't know it from Parappa the Rapper. I know it from the far superior game."
Oh, I see. You're right.
So that was my wildcard topic for today. I just wanted to take
Brilliant.
it back.
Fucking excellent. No, fabulous games. If you talk to Rosie about Parappa the Rapper, Rosie Caddick, but just to talk about it briefly, because obviously this is not quite as big a part of my childhood, but I remember the demo to Parappa the Rapper. I have both, as you've seen. I've got both Parappa the Rapper and Jammer Lammy, and I played Parappa a lot later. And the problem with Parappa the Rapper, if you play it on a PS2, which I will because it's a much better laser for CDs, is that there's an input delay. So when you play the flea market level, which is in like 6/8 time or something like that, it's really difficult to do, and I've never got past it. So there's that. But and then the other thing as well is I remember my mate hating Parappa the Rapper because he had the demo which came with Tekken 2. If you fail it, you press X to leave, as opposed to every other game at the time we had, which was select. So you press X straight away, it binge you out, and you remember thinking that's really, really bad. And I went, no, all you got to do is just press circle. So that's a vivid memory of mine because he hated.
I will say
it.
the only
Like,
other the only other Jammer Lammy lore that I really know of is that there was an arcade version that was produced. It was Japan only. I think it was produced in 1999. It might have been 2000. I'm not 100% certain on that one, but it was thought to be lost media for the longest time until Jonathan Ross, of all people, found an arcade machine and has restored it. And because
he has his uses, doesn't he?
He does. So because of Jonathan Ross's efforts for game preservation, we now have some dumps of the Jammer Lammy arcade game out there.
Fabulous.
Which is just insane as a statement to put out.
I just want to go to Japan. That's what I want to do. That's really, no, I've really enjoyed that, listening to that, anything like that. And that ties in with what I said about art and engineering, because that memory of like sitting and playing through something silly like that, that's a memory that other people might share about something different. You know what I mean? Like that's just like the game. You've basically exploited the game. You know, we talk about the glitches there. People aren't looking at the story they've been told. You know, this doesn't happen with a book, does it? You don't turn around and go, well, how's the paper been formed or anything like that. You know, it's like, I
speed ran this book.
yeah. It's just something about games where you sort of like have that. If I do this, will this happen? You know what I mean? Like that.
They're a very unique piece of media.
Absolutely, and the best as far as I'm concerned. So brilliant, cool. Well, that's been really enjoyable. I think we could have probably talked longer about Final Fantasy VI, but alas, we won't for now. So thanks for joining, and I'll have to plug the YouTube channel now that it's doing quite well. So we are on YouTube as EXP Required. I think the tag at the moment is EXP Podcast, but EXP Required, we are on there as well on YouTube. So please go and check
Where
that
else
out.
can we find you, Jack?
You can also find me on Twitter for now. There's a better option under @JackMullen8, and I also have my other YouTube channel, 2 Random Words. How about yourself, Mol?
Wonderful. I can also be found on Twitter @Adramalek, where I am currently documenting my extensive Final Fantasy figure collection. Wonderful. Brilliant. Well, thank you for today, Jack.
Thank you for today.
Again soon.
Speak to you soon. Ta-ta.
Wonderful.